So, hello everyone, and a warm welcome to my podcast, Don't Get a Therapist Yet. And today I am very pleased to introduce my very special guest. His name is Dr. Chris Irons, and he's a clinical psychologist. So, a warm welcome to you, Chris. And
Thank you so much for having me, Wendy. It's a pleasure
it,
to be here.
it's a real pleasure. And just for the audience, could you just tell the audience a little bit more about yourself, your experiencing, and the projects you're involved with?
I guess there's tons of stuff I could say, but I'm a clinical psychologist, which means that I work therapeutically with people trying to, I guess, help people understand themselves, understand their difficulties they face in life, to try to find new ways of moving forward in life and new ways of tackling struggles and distress. I guess alongside being a clinical psychologist, I am also an author, a researcher. So I spend time researching and publishing research wherever I can do. And I also do quite a lot of training in the approach that I love compassion focused therapy. So
Yeah.
I help train up other people, other therapists and other clinicians in this way of working and supervise their work and so on. So I guess I wear a number of different hats in my day-to-day life, which I absolutely love. But I guess the mainstay of it all is as a clinical psychologist who's bothered about distress and suffering and how compassion can be a powerful way of trying to relieve and prevent suffering.
Absolutely, Chris, and a great introduction explanation. And I'm a massive fan of compassion focused therapy, sometimes called CFT for short. We might just call it CFT. And there may be listeners here because I still don't think it's as well known. A lot of people know about cognitive behavior therapy, but they don't know so much about compassion focused therapy. So could you just give us a sort of an overview of some of the principles about it and what it means and how it works? I know that's a big ask, but if you could just give a bit of an overview.
Yeah, I'll try and do my best in a brief way, Wendy. CFT was developed by a professor in the UK called Paul Gilbert. Paul had, I guess, a number of different therapeutic influences on him. So CFT has multiple influences on it. So it's influenced by cognitive behavioral therapy, but also psychodynamic ideas and principles, attachment theory, but also draws from really interesting psychological ideas like attachment theory, social psychology ideas, developmental psychology, neuroscience, evolutionary theory. So CFT is a really highly integrated approach. And the reason why it initially developed was in Paul Gilbert's work going back, 30 years or something like that, in which when he was working with people who were often very distressed, quite traumatized, people who had maybe been to many other therapies and never really made full recoveries, had maybe tried lots of different medications and never fully found them beneficial. And one of the things that Paul was finding that some of the standard therapeutic interventions that he would use, in cognitive therapy, that might be things like helping people to map out their negative thoughts and their feelings about themselves that are linked to these negative thoughts, and then helping people to try to generate a new way of thinking about themselves, their situation. That while some of his clients, of Paul's clients, seem to do really, really well in these types of standard therapeutic interventions, they seem to benefit massively. There were a number of clients who could kind of do the interventions. They could kind of engage in them to a certain extent, but they weren't finding them helpful. And Paul was kind of interested in why that was the case. And he had this insight one day that when he was asking one of his clients to kind of tell him, look, as you're reading through these sort of more balanced and more helpful and supportive ways of thinking about yourself and your situation, how are you saying it to yourself? So inside your own mind, as you're reading through these statements that we've generated that could be supportive and caring, things that you might say to a friend or somebody that you love, but one of his clients started telling him that she was saying it to herself with an inner voice tone that was full of anger and rage and disgust and contempt. And it was with this kind of insight that whilst we can begin to try to change the content of our thoughts, the way that we think about ourselves or the situation, the emotional tone, the way that we feel and the emotions that come with that towards ourselves can make a massive difference on that. And so Paul got very intrigued that sometimes our inner relationships and the inner emotions and the way that we feel about ourselves particularly when it's full of self-criticism and self-hatred and shame and so on, can be really a huge block to the effectiveness of therapy. And interestingly, this has been backed up by all sorts of interesting research. There was a big study that was published, which basically combines lots of other smaller studies that was published a few years ago that found that clients who start therapy with higher levels of self-criticism do worse by the end of therapy than those clients who start therapy with lower levels of self-criticism. So Paul was kind of tapping into something along these lines 30 odd years ago. And so what Paul started to try to touch on was this idea that if any of your audience who are listening now, if you were to think about somebody who you care for, who was going through a very difficult time, and if you were trying to be supportive and kind and caring and compassionate to them, probably you can start thinking about the words that you might say to this person, but there's also something in the how you would say it to them. So we tend not to, if we're with somebody that we love and who's suffering and struggling, try to say warm and caring and empathetic things in a really angry voice tone. Because although the words are really lovely, the anger, of course, dilutes any of the positivity of the words. Or if you could imagine speaking to a friend, and again, you were trying to be kind and caring and empathetic, but if you said it with a completely blank facial expression and a voice tone that sounded like one of those computer generated AI voices, probably it wouldn't land very well in your friend because it sounds artificial, it doesn't sound like it's genuine. And so, in a way, what Paul started touching on was what would it be like for people to start having that emotional inner voice tone? So instead of actually having one towards themselves that's full of anger and contempt and shame and hostility, could people start practicing a more kind, caring, warm, empathetic inner voice tone to themselves? And so he started trying that out with some of his clients. And initially, many of the people he worked with absolutely hated it. They just didn't know how to do this. It felt alien, it felt scary, it felt weird. But with practice, with exposure, working on inner voice tones, taking ideas and practices from sort of Western psychotherapeutic traditions, but also learning from, utilizing, adapting practices that have been integrated into Buddhism for many thousands of years. CFT kind of integrates this approach then in which a primary way that we're trying to help people is by trying to tap in not just to the way that people think about themselves and others, but thinking about the motivation that they have towards themselves. They're trying to tap into a caring, supportive motivation, but also emotional tone, which can be warmer, more kind, and more caring. And that by doing so, this can have a very powerful effect, just like it can have when you're being like that with somebody that you love, that you care for, just that your way of being with them can be really supportive and helpful for them. Can we start doing this for ourselves? And I guess a way that I've always tried to see this, Wendy, is that if you think about it, many of us as kids are encouraged to be kind and caring and supportive to others. You know, we're told to and taught to be like that with other people. But for many of us, when are we ever taught how to be that with ourselves? When are we ever explicitly taught how to be as kind, caring, and supportive to ourselves as we might be to our best friends or the people that we love the most? And I guess an additional bit to that is if we were to add up every single hour that you ever spend in relationship with somebody else, so this could be with your family members, your parents, your siblings, your friends, your colleagues at work, your romantic partners, your children. If you add up all of those hours, it comes nowhere close to the amount of hours you will be in relationship with yourself. But of course, the crucial thing is, what type of relationship do you have with yourself? Do you treat yourself with the same kindness, care, empathy, and so on as you do the people around you that you love the most? And not for everyone, but for many people, it turns out they find that much harder to be kind and caring to themselves than they are to other people. And so CFT really started with this idea that shame and self-criticism can be really a barrier to change, and that actually compassion can be an antidote to shame and self-criticism, but that to become and utilize compassion, you have to practice it. So a little bit like you have to practice how to ride a bike, you have to practice how to swim, you have to practice how to drive a car. actually being compassionate with oneself and learning to be also open potentially to the compassion from other people can take practice. And so that's what we try to spend time doing in CFT. And the lovely thing has been over the years, we're finding that this approach can be very, very powerful for people. And we each month there's almost like a new research paper out showing the potential benefits of CFT for a whole range of human distress, basically things that humans suffer with and struggle with across the world. So we're very excited about where this approach might go to, and how many people we might be able to help with it.
Yes, I mean, and a wonderful explanation, Chris. Thank you so much for that. And I said I am a huge fan as a therapist myself. I'm a huge fan, and I'm an accredited CBT therapist. Well, what I start off with is people come to see me for CBT, but then I kind of
Yeah.
slip in the CFT as well. And
Yes.
it doesn't take much actually for people to start to grasp the concept, and they say, "Oh, I've just got to learn to be kinder to myself." And yeah, my inner voice is really harsh and critical, isn't it? So it's something about the concept itself. Once they grasp the concept, they really get it as well.
Mm,
It's just so powerful, isn't it? And I love the way the how Paul Gilbert has explained how the brain works as well. I think I use that a lot as well regarding the three circle um, situation. So that's a wonderful, wonderful explanation of
mm,
CFT. So thank you so much for that.
mm.
And I think also if people want to know more, they can contact you, or there's loads of books that they've written that actually explain in
Yes.
more detail the theory behind it as well.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm sure in the show notes we'll have links to places where people can find out more. And of course, we take a bit of time to explain what compassion is and what it's not, because there's a lot of myths about compassion that it's just about
Exactly.
being
Yeah.
nice or just about being kind, or some people have some fears and concerns that compassion can be a bit wishy-washy, or it's like letting ourselves or others off the hook, or that when we become more compassionate, we'll make more mistakes. So there can be lots of concerns and fears. But in CFT, we basically have a simple way of understanding compassion, which is compassion is a sensitivity to the suffering of ourselves and other people, with a desire, a commitment to try to relieve that distress and suffering, and trying to prevent it from coming back in the future. And it's really interesting, Wendy, that actually when we really start thinking about compassion, often compassion, rather than being soft and weak and a bit wishy-washy, often takes quite a lot of courage, often takes a lot of strength. An example we sometimes use is that, a great example of compassion are firefighters. So often what takes firefighters into training to be a firefighter is a compassionate motivation. They are bothered about people who are suffering, trapped in burning buildings and so on, and they will dedicate their lives to trying to find ways to relieve that, to save people. But it's really interesting when you think about firefighters, would you ever describe firefighters as weak or wishy-washy or selfish or indulgent? Well, of course, none of us ever think about that. If anything, of course, what do we describe firefighters as needing and requiring? Well, strength and courage. And certainly it's the same when it comes to working with our own pain. For example, if I have experienced trauma, or if I've experienced something awful that's happened to me in life, actually doing the first part of compassion, which is basically tuning into it, engaging in it, trying to understand that pain, that's hard. I mean, that's turning towards painful things. It's not avoiding it, it's turning towards painful things. And so, actually, that takes quite a lot of courage. It takes quite a lot of tolerating of distress. It takes a lot of strength and groundedness.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, the second part of compassion is not just about tuning in and having empathy and understanding, it's also about taking wise action. It's also trying to think about, so again, if I go back to the example of firefighters, you don't just get a bunch of brave people off the street and actually just put them in the gear of a firefighter and just say run into a burning building. Of course, firefighters train for many, many years to how safely and wisely to enter burning buildings and not cause more harm in what they're doing to themselves or to other people in the building. And of course, when it comes to ourselves and working with our own pain, it's something similar. How do we learn wise ways of working with the way that our minds are, to work with the traumas that we've gone through that actually are not our fault, to work with the fact that we've got this brain that can get caught up in shame and self-criticism and treating ourselves and saying things to ourselves that, as far as we know, no other animal
Mm.
can think about themselves and feel about themselves. And actually, it's something which we can begin to learn then wisely, how do we work with our own pain? How do we find ways to try to reduce it? And if possible, try to prevent it from returning?
It's a very important concept, isn't it, of compassion? And you're such a great metaphor, the firefighters. I love that as well,
Mm,
because it is about facing things and working towards things and understanding things as well, which does take a lot of courage. I always say that people come to therapy, they're the ones with the courage. It's not a weakness, it's a strength because they have a willingness to
exactly.
open and work on their issues and to be open and willing to engage. So, yeah, that's a really good way of expressing that. And also the action behind it, I think is a very important thing as well. It's not just a theoretically being kind to yourself. There is actually work to be done regarding how you address certain situations in your
Yeah,
life as well. So, really good
exactly.
point. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And I just wanted to dive a little bit more deeply because I know one of the books you have written, and I'm going to show it because I've got it right here, is a book about difficult emotions. And the reason I really love the book is I think sometimes in cognitive behavior therapy, it's sort of like emotions are sort of a little bit described a little bit like they're sort of, linked to thoughts really. Whereas I think
Mm,
you go into so much more depth as to more, what are emotions, what are their role, what's their functioning, and how you can get better at managing your emotions. Could you just tell us a little bit more about, that book and why you wrote it and a couple of examples that actually you could share with the audience?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wrote the book in part because, I have struggled with my emotions throughout my life in various different ways, and I'll touch on that a little bit later on. So it was a kind of personal project as much as a project for others. I guess if I'm thinking about others and myself as a clinician, as a therapist, regardless of somebody's diagnosis or regardless of the reason why somebody's coming to see me, for example, the death of their partner or a setback or a failure or whatever it might be, a health condition that they're very anxious about. Every single person I've ever worked with on one level or another has been experiencing distress because of something to do with their feelings and emotions. And so this is something which goes across every single person that I've ever worked with in my career. It links to everything that can contribute to us struggling as human beings. And so emotions are kind of center ground. They're not sort of a secondary or, they're really center ground to so much of the work that we do as clinicians, but so much of the experience of being a human. And I guess from a CFT point of view, the way that we would see emotions is partly within an evolutionary context. So from an evolutionary theory point of view, you constantly have to think about if we continue to have the experience of something and something that can cause us great pain, like disgust or shame or grief, why would we have this thing called emotions like grief and rage and disgust that can cause us so much pain and suffering? And to answer that, in part, of course, we can think about, well, could we see this through the lens of function? So, what we mean by function is there a reason why we have these emotions? Because they help us under certain conditions. And so it's a very technical language, but one way you can think about it is something called an evolutionary functional analysis. So basically, to get away from the jargon, it's trying to think about, can we think about what function different emotions might serve for us that might have had an evolutionary advantage for us by the fact that we can experience that?
Hmm.
So, what do I mean by that? Well, if we were to take anxiety or fear, what a horrible experience. Your heart rate goes up, you feel tense, you find it very hard to feel settled, and you can get trapped in this state, and like it's awful. And it's the underpinning of, anxiety disorders, OCD, phobias, all sorts of things. But one way of thinking about it is, well, what would it be like if we lived in a world where you couldn't experience those emotions? So, for example, if anybody listening to this right now, imagine that somehow you were going for a walk along your street. And as you're walking along the street that you live on, you see a car driving towards you. And as the car drives towards you, suddenly you see your next door neighbor's cat shoot out onto the road. And the car driver sees this cat and suddenly swerves the car, misses the cat, luckily, but now, unfortunately, the car is careering directly towards you. You're in mortal danger. Would you want to be in that situation without being able to experience anxiety, panic, or fear? And when you get people to think about that, almost automatically people start shaking their heads. And then, of course, the point there would be, well, why not? Because, of course, without those emotions, you still have your thinking mind. You still know a car coming towards you is dangerous, it could kill you. But what is it about lacking those emotions that would be problematic? And of course, one way of thinking about it is that whilst you know the car is dangerous, without those emotions, maybe your response is slower. Because the whole point about being able to experience emotions in partly is it prepares the body for action. It is a very powerful, very immediate way of energizing the body, basically to serve some simple motives. And here with the car example, it would be for the motive of threat protection, of harm avoidance. So you have with your emotions here, let's say panic, a rapid, non-conscious increase in heart rate, increase in muscle tone, an increase in a bodily urge to act. And what is the bodily urge to act in this context? Well, it will be to run away, to jump out of the way. So with that emotion, in that context, it is, from an evolutionary point of view, a really helpful thing. The tricky thing with emotions, and this is why the book's called Difficult Emotions, is not that emotions in themselves are bad or wrong or problematic. Actually, they are very useful for us. The problem is that our emotions can get out of shape. They can become, and I talk about it in the book, and it's an oversimplified way, but our struggles really with emotions are too much or too little. What I mean by that is when I say too much of an emotion, let's say too much of anxiety or too much of fear. What that means is that the emotion is triggered too often, too frequently. What that means is that it gets triggered when there isn't a car careering towards you. It gets triggered in a context where actually there isn't danger around you. Too much emotion or too much anxiety or fear would also be that when it turns up, it comes at a volume that is too loud. So rather than it being appropriate with the thing that's going on in your life, it comes on almost like the stereo comes on full blast. It turns up really loud and really powerful inside you. A third thing can be that when it turns up, it stays online too long. So rather than sort of turning up and then being able to gently switch off again, it stays on for an extended period of time, which then can become harmful. And of course, there are other bits too, but that's the description of the book about emotions that are too much, and they can cause us too many problems. So too much anxiety, too much fear, too much sadness, too much shame. So these are emotions that turn up in this way, which take them beyond the initial evolutionary purpose of having that emotion. The flip side is a little bit like the version I told you about with the car, is too little emotion. And that's where in life we can struggle in life because we're not able to experience certain emotions when it might be quite helpful to experience that emotion. So an example of that would be that, what I said about the car with anxiety. Another example might well be with sadness. For many of us, sadness is an unpleasant emotion. But if we're completely devoid of sadness, how are other people going to know when we're struggling? How are other people going to know when we're in a lot of pain or something really awful has happened to us? Because, of course, sadness evolved in part to emerge when we've experienced some sort of disconnection or some sort of loss in life. And, of course, sadness, when it shows itself on its face or through tears or through voice tone, is a very, very powerful way of signaling to other people that we need help. And so with too little emotions, that's where actually these emotions don't turn up very often. In fact, they're kind of absent from us. If they turn up, it's almost like the volume is too low. So imagine watching a TV show, but the volume set so low that you can't hear what the characters are doing. You can't understand what's going on. And also maybe when they turn up, they last such a short amount of time that you don't even notice them, that they kind of turn and they turn off so quickly. So in the book, what I try to decipher here is between these two typical differences or difficulties, sorry, that we can experience with emotions, and then try to take people through ideas about how developing mindfulness and compassion can initially be a helpful thing for that, to learn a little bit in terms of psychoeducation about why actually our emotions, why we have them, why they're useful, but also how many of us struggle with our emotions. And then towards the end part of the book, thinking about different ways and techniques and strategies to try to help us either, if we're struggling with too much emotion, what are ways in which not to get rid of, but to be able to kind of just work with them to reduce sometimes the frequency or the potency or the volume or the intensity of them. But also then to see for those people who are struggling with not enough emotion about stuff, how can we turn up the volume a little bit? How can we help people to safely begin to feel and express more anger or more sadness or more anxiety in a way that could be useful both for themselves, but also in communicating with other people around them that they might need something, that they are feeling a certain way and that they might need some sort of support or something might need to change in their lives.
And it's a very good thing to talk about because again, I think sometimes if you take like a very simple cognitive behavior therapy approach, is sort of the emotions aren't even in the title, are they? It's
Yeah.
CBT. But what the problem is, most people feel these emotions, don't they? It's that dysregulation of their emotions, which is part of the way why they come to therapy because they feel sort of, out of control of their emotions really and their
Yeah.
thoughts as well. So to actually have a kind of an understanding of, and it's not just about expressing emotions, it's about having that real deep understanding of why we have these emotions and how they're affecting us. And there's a hope that you can learn these techniques and do something about it. I mean, that's such a positive message. And I think people get it well because they understand that's just how I feel. I don't want to feel this way anymore. Oh, it's in your head. No, it's actually in my body. That's how I feel it. So
Yeah.
it's and I love the blend of the emotional, understand the emotional with the understanding of the cognitive CFT approach, where you're really trying to understand how your body is and why it's the way it is. Great
Mm.
explanations of it. Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right, Wendy. I mean, the point is that your emotions evolve for a purpose, and they're
Mm,
not just secondary to something else.
mm,
They are central to our lives. Without emotions, so much would become difficult in life. I mean, imagine, the birth of your child, but not being able to experience joy. Imagine the death of your parents, but not feeling any sadness. Imagine seeing your child be bullied at school, but be indifferent to it, not be angry.
mm,
The point is, we need emotions.
mm,
They signal to us something important. There's a really lovely way a psychologist, a very well-known psychologist, described emotions as being like relevance radars. So they help us to know what's relevant. We
mm,
tend to feel emotional about things that matter.
mm,
For example, if you don't care about football, and let's say the England football team loses the World Cup final, how are you going to feel? You don't care because it's not relevant to you. But if you do like football and if you do like England, then that's going to matter a lot if they
mm,
lose or if they win. You're going to have very different emotional reactions. So the point is, emotions bring color to things. And it's important that we are able to experience our emotions because they give you information about how you're getting on, about what's
mm,
happening in life. And again, going back to the book, the problem often is that if you're not getting that information, if your emotions are blocked somehow, you're not able to notice them, experience them, or express them, that's going to be difficult. And it's not your fault. I mean, if we think in our culture, so many of us, if I take young boys, were taught that you
oh
can't
yeah.
cry, you can't be sad, you need to be strong, you need to be a man. How many young girls were taught that anger was bad? That they can't be assertive and they'd be called names, in really awful names, if they were shown to be angry and so on. So we can be conditioned into emotions that are okay and emotions that aren't okay. So there can be all sorts of reasons why we struggle with our emotions. But the whole point is that from an evolutionary point of view, these are so important. And that if you're blocked to them, or if it's a bit like your emotions, a bit like the dog walks you rather than
Mm,
you walking the dog, if your emotions are basically tumbling out and it feels like you're not able to be able to manage them or direct them or to do something helpful with them, then of course life can get very, very difficult and very, very painful. So the book is really about how can we become more aware of this inside all of us, and then of course what steps can we take to bring a different approach to working with our emotions in life.
And I think another key component of CFT I really like is the sort of science, the evolutionary science behind what you're saying, to sort of say, well, it's not your fault. Emotions are there for a purpose. That's how we're made. We're made to feel, aren't we? We're not like an AI bot where there is no emotions, is there? And we need
Yes.
emotions to be alive and to feel alive and to have the full range of emotions that you're having as well. That's what makes us fully human, doesn't it? But just understanding more about, how your body works, how your emotions work. I've found that that simple intervention a very powerful tool, so people that then feel more empowered to say, oh, right, now I understand how my body and my mind works, and it makes sense to me. Oh, that's why I react in that way as well. So again, I think that
It's
that's
a
really
beautiful
useful.
point, Wendy. Yeah, it's very much for us thinking about how do we help people to develop insight and wisdoms about themselves. And I guess, from my point of view, and I'm biased, at school we teach kids amazing things about physics and about biology and about our DNA and mathematics and amazing, amazing things. But we still don't teach kids what I would argue is the most important thing, which is understanding about
Mm,
this thing inside your head. To understand about our brain and body, how it works, why it works the way it is, and so on. And so for us, whether it's therapy or whether it's through a self-help book or whether it's through anything else, how can we help people to understand something about themselves? Because once you do start understanding about it, and recognize that it's not your fault. None of us chose to have emotions. None of us chose to be able to experience shame or disgust or anger or fear. None of us chose this. We come pre programmed with the potential to experience this because, just like other animals, having access to emotions is helpful in certain contexts. The problem is, if you feel ashamed of your emotions, or if you feel threatened about your emotions, or if you criticize yourself about your emotions, or you have a belief that you shouldn't feel emotions in a certain way, then of course it's like we're battling ourselves. It's like
mm,
I've got something in my head that say that this natural thing shouldn't be there. It's a little bit like saying my natural hunger shouldn't be there, or my natural need to go to the toilet shouldn't be there. I mean, the point is, of course, going to the toilet, urinating and defecating. It's not particularly nice. It doesn't smell nice. It doesn't sound nice, or so on. But the whole point is, we wouldn't need to judge this thing because it's there for an evolutionary function. Animals take in food and water in one end and they get rid of it at the other end. It's a biological imperative. Being critical of it or shaming ourselves for it, we tend not to do that. But when it comes to our emotions, we do tend to have a critical, shaming, or judging way of approaching some of our emotions, how they work, and a sense of what that makes us as a human being. When actually, if we can basically just see it, we didn't choose this stuff. Actually, it's been shaped, partly our emotions have been shaped by the way we've been raised, by our cultures, by all sorts of different things that we didn't choose. But once we can look into it and actually start thinking about, okay, so how do I take responsibility? How do I step back from shame and self criticism? How do I step back from emotions about my own emotions? So I can feel anxious about my anger. I
mm.
can feel angry about my sadness, so we can have all these complex interplays because as a human being, we've got this complex brain that can get into conflicts and all sorts of stuff. Once I can see all of that in front of me, recognize it's not my fault, but how do I take responsibility for it? Then, of course, we can start seeing. It's not that life becomes easy, but it's definitely a lot easier the more wise you are
Absolutely.
to these processes.
And again, just a big on that point is I think you explain very well in the book about the different variations of it. You could be anxious about being angry, you could feel shame about being angry or fearful as
Mm-hmm.
well. That's that array of emotions and how they interplay place with each other. I think it's a really good important point because people often come confused and I just feel so much and it doesn't make sense
Yeah,
to them. But if you can actually again make sense of why you're thinking or feeling that way, again, it helps to feel in control. It feels I understand myself better as well, and I understand what I'm doing now. Oh, that makes sense to me, isn't it? Sometimes it's just a whirlpool in the person's sort
exactly.
of head and thoughts, and it just feels out of control. And why do I feel so bad about myself? Why am I out of control of myself? Okay, all right, that explanation makes sense to me. I know what I'm
Yeah,
doing now, and it because I know what I'm doing, I can therefore correct it as well. Okay,
exactly.
so yeah, that's a beautiful explanation. Thank you so much for that, Chris. Um, I'm so glad you wrote that book. I think it's a really good book, and all your books are very good, but I particularly enjoyed that one.
Thank
Um,
you.
but that's not the only thing you've been involved with. You've also have created an app, which is a very modern
Mm.
thing to do now. Everybody's creating apps. So tell us a little more about the app that you created and who's it for and how can people use it?
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. So we were approached by a wonderful company called Site, which stands for Psychology Technologies, and essentially their idea was to take self-help books and to turn them into apps. Which, when I heard it, I was like, "That's a fantastic idea." Because, of course, as much as I like self-help books, it's kind of hard to carry around a self-help book in your pocket. It's not so easy. And of course, these days, most of us carry around a smartphone in our pockets. It goes with us all the time. And so therefore, I thought this is just such a good idea, such a good idea. So the challenge was to take one of the books that I helped to co-write, which is called the Compassionate Mind Workbook, which was a book that, yeah, you might have it somewhere there as well with you, Wendy, which was a really big
It,
and long
it
book, which was,
it's not that
yeah,
easy
that
to carry
one.
around with you. I agree with that.
It's
It's a very good
very
book.
difficult
Yeah,
to
much
put
I've
that one in your pocket. Exactly. That's a very difficult one to squeeze into your pocket. So the idea was to take something really big, and it's been helpful for people. We get lovely feedback about it, but could we put this into the form of an app? So the book has 28 chapters, and the app has 28 sessions or lessons. But in the app, each session, the text is only something like 300 words. So each session, you have a short amount of an idea that you can either read or you can listen to an audio that will read it to you, sort of read it out. And then at the end of each session, there's a practice, something that brings to life what we've just introduced and can be useful in your life in some way or another. And so the point is that you could take any of these sessions just randomly, but it's a little bit like a course in a way that if you start at session one and go through them sequentially, that actually what you're doing is kind of building your capacity, you're building your strength, and you're learning how to learn something about yourself, learn about how your mind works, learning about how your emotions work, learning about key things that can be useful for developing the capacity to start working in and with compassion. So, learning about your attention, practicing mindfulness, practicing different exercises which help to stimulate a branch of our nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, which can really help to ground ourselves, to slow down, and to be able to balance out our threat system and the physiology of threat and stress inside the human body. And then, of course, begin to build what we call compassionate mind training, which is how can we build our mind in wisdom, care, and an understanding and strength to be able to engage in things that we struggle with. And so the app is a very practical way. It's very interactive. There are guides into how to do things. And what I really appreciated in doing it and the feedback that we've got from people is that because you've kind of got this with you and you get prompts for it and it's very interactive, it's a very different way of doing self-help. It's not that I'm anti self-help books, you know, I've written many of them, but it's just a different way of taking in information, a different way of practicing. And I guess the analogy that I've always used, Wendy, is you know, if you go down to a gym, there isn't just one machine that you can use to get fit. You know, gyms have multiple different machines that, in a way, all of them do the same thing in the sense that they help to get you fitter and stronger. But of course, they do it in a different way. You know, when you go on the machine to push out weights like that, that's, you know, doing maybe your shoulders and your chest. That's very different to when you sit on the thing and use your legs. That's doing a different muscles. They are both helping you to get fit, but it's just in a different way, targeting different things. I guess the difference between the book and the app is that they're both helping you to try to find ways to develop more understanding about yourself, to develop more compassion for yourself and for others, is just helping people to access this in different ways. So I have to say, I think probably it's the thing that I'm most proud of. Obviously, I didn't do the coding of it and I didn't do the tech side of it, but in terms of how it's turned out and how easy it is to access for people. Certainly, that's been one of the big things that I've had feedback on that people have found it very helpful, whether they're in therapy, so maybe using it alongside compassion focused therapy, or just outside of therapy, just as a way to begin to start approach of thinking about and working with whatever difficulties you might face.
And I think you've tapped into something really important here, Chris. And I think books are great. And, and I sort of dip in out and out of them a lot.
Yeah,
But a lot of people, perhaps, especially if they're distressed, then they're or they're neurodiverse, that they're not that good at reading now and actually
yeah,
take another process of taking the information on their phone, which they can access at any point that they need to.
exactly.
It's such an amazing way of doing things now, and I think it's sort of we're so much more techie now. We've got all our phones with us as well, so it's very accessible as well. And to
Exactly.
have those sort of golden nuggets that people can go away, they could invest in this app, and I think they could learn so much about CFT without even needing to go and see a therapist. It's such a powerful tool, I think,
Mm,
for people to start. And I'm also very keen as a therapist to do things that are very well researched. I know you
yeah,
spend a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of effort in your training, your development to do something really so very well written, but evidence based as well. It's not some sort of fluffy idea about, happy clappy mindset type of thing. It's
no,
it's really sort of deep and well thought out. Lots of evidence
yes,
based, lots of research in it as well, so people know they can trust it as well. It has a lot of credibility, I think, for all those
yes.
reasons.
That's a really lovely way of putting it, Wendy. And it's been a really important thing within CFT, but also for Paul Gilbert in particular, I guess, I mean, he's a clinician, but he's also a academic, he's a professor. And, what we're interested in CFT is to be able to show that from the start to the end, whether it's in therapy or we call it compassionate mind training when it's outside of therapy, where I don't know, the book that you just showed or the app, is to be able to show that from the start to the end that we can show significant improvements. And so luckily we published a study recently on the app and showed that after using it for 28 days, people reported significantly less shame and self-criticism. They reported less psychological distress. So symptom wise, we had reductions in things like stress and anxiety and so on, but also they had significant increases in things like well-being and let's say self-compassion. So we could actually see by using this, just using the app, no therapy, but just that could lead to changes in the right way. But also some of my colleagues have been trying to look at this in a different way. So for example, what they've done is to take people into a lab and put them in a brain scanner and
Okay.
got people basically do, thinking of a scenario where there's been something difficult in life, like a rejection or a setback in life, and then to spend some time criticizing themselves about that setback. And when they do it on the brain scanner, you can see certain parts of the brain start to light up and start to get, particularly active. And then thinking about the same problem, they then ask people to do one of the practices, for example, developing your compassionate self, so a common practice in compassion focused therapy. And from this wise, kind, caring part of self to just sort of direct understanding towards self instead. And so in the brain scanner, instead of it being lighted up like a Christmas tree of all the threat areas that we saw as self criticism, suddenly you see this other pattern in the brain start to light up, in which you get a reduction in areas of the brain like the amygdala and so on, which can be linked to threat, but actually an increase in other areas of the brain, which can be linked to empathy and care and so on. So the lovely thing here is that you rightly say this isn't just like a nice thing. And compassion is this kind of, it's a nice thing. And yes, people should be kind and compassionate. The point is that you've got lots of studies showing that when you practice compassion, this has significant influences on patterning in your brain. It has significant influences on your body, the branch of your nervous system that you're accessing and utilizing. And so that's quite important for us that we can show across multiple types of evidence, I guess, that what we're doing here is actually landing and making an effect.
And the thing that I notice is that, distress is not going away. If anything, it's getting worse and higher. And
Mm,
younger people are doing this and suffering so much as well. That, we really do need these tools. As a nation, we need these tools. The media is full of sort of negativity and threat-induced information as well. So I
yes,
don't think you need to be particular if you're just a little bit upset or stressed. I think you really benefit from this app as well. Just learning some well-being techniques which are very well researched and very well practiced as well. So I don't
exactly.
think it's bigger than people who are suffering distress and anxiety and thinking about going to therapy. To me, it's just a sort sort of like, something a lot of people can really benefit from,
Yeah.
and really grasping these tools in a very user-friendly, easy way to access them as well. So I really want to thank you for taking the time and effort to design this. And I think it's,
Mm.
amazingly beneficial.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So hopefully some people will think, oh, how can I find out more? What are all these resources that Chris is talking about? And how can they find out more? How can they get in touch with you, Chris?
Well, again, we will put some details in the show notes. There's two websites in particular. One is called Balanced Minds, which is a compassion focused company that myself and some colleagues set up basically to bring CFT into the world in a whole variety of different ways. But there's loads of different resources and free things to read and to practice audio files and some of the key practices that we use in compassion focused therapy. You can jump on that website and try them out. I've also got a personal website, drchrisirons.com, which again has just got a bunch of resources and says more about me and some of the things that I do. But within both of those websites, there will be very clear links to some of the books that I've written, to the app, but also to other types of resources that can be just quite useful for people to begin to learn more about CFT and to start their journey if they're interested into this approach. And of course, I am very very biased, but this is an approach which I use with myself. It's not that I'm here just using this with other people. This is something, I'm a human being that goes through the ups and downs of life, like other people, and will experience distress and suffering about all sorts of things. And so, very much, this has been transformative as an approach for me personally. And it's something, of course, that I want to try to help other people with as much as possible. And if anybody would like to get in contact directly, my email address will also be in the show notes as well. I'm very happy for people to drop me an email to ask me any questions. I'm more than happy to try to help out if I can do.
That's really kind of you, Chris. Thank you so much for sharing so much information as well. And I love your explanations of things and how they worked. I think they were absolutely amazing. So thank you so much for being a guest on my show. And yes,
Our
if you want
pleasure.
to know any more information, please look at the show notes. And if not, I'm sure you can just Google Dr. Chris Irons and your website will probably come up as well, won't it? If you can't
Yeah,
remember
exactly. That's
exactly
right.
it, yeah, just Google your name
Exactly.
and it will come up. Okay. So
Exactly.
thank you very much. And thank you for everyone who's listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.